A man opened a wall in his basement. What was hidden inside shocked the experts. The first crack appeared on a Sunday morning, just below the fuse box in Daniel Reese's basement. He'd been meaning to repaint the concrete walls for months, ever since the damp stains began creeping up like bruises after every heavy rain. But when he crouched to inspect it that day, he noticed something strange. The crack wasn't following the pattern of the others. It wasn't spreading outward or downward. It curved, forming almost a perfect semicircle. Foundations shifting again, he muttered, tapping the wall with the handle of his screwdriver. The sound was hollow. That stopped him cold. Daniel frowned, tapping again, harder this time. Hollow, not the dull thud of solid concrete, but a faint echo, like there was space behind it. That didn't make sense. The basement's back wall was supposed to sit flush against the earth. He fetched a hammer. Just one test swing, he told himself. A single chip to see what was underneath. The concrete flaked away too easily, thin, brittle, almost like plaster. Behind it was darkness, a hollow cavity. He leaned closer, flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam slipped through the narrow opening, illuminating what looked like brickwork. Old bricks, dark and uneven. Someone had built a wall behind the wall. That realization sank in like ice water. Why would anyone seal off part of a basement? He widened the hole, dust coating his face, fragments scattering across the floor. Behind the thin layer of cement, the true structure began to emerge. Red brick, hand-laid, mortared shut with care. And there, near the center, something was carved into one of the bricks. A faint marking, a symbol shaped like a circle crossed by two lines. Daniel brushed it with his thumb. The surface felt gritty, but the symbol had depth, carved deliberately. He stepped back, staring. His basement had been built in 1972. But these bricks, they were older. Much older. For the rest of the day, Daniel couldn't stop glancing toward that patch of wall. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. He didn't know it yet, but that small crack wasn't just a flaw in the foundation. It was the beginning of something that had been buried and sealed for almost a century. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The image of the hollow wall hovered behind his eyelids like a question that refused to die. At around 2 a.m., he finally gave up trying to rest, slipped into jeans and a hoodie, and crept down the basement steps barefoot. The air was cool and damp, carrying that faint mineral scent of earth and iron. His flashlight's beam jittered across the concrete floor until it stopped on the jagged patch of broken plaster. It looked darker now, like an open wound. He crouched and ran his fingers along the edges of the exposed brick. The mortar had aged into a hard, chalky gray, but beneath the grime, the bricks were unlike anything used in modern construction. Rougher, uneven in size, the kind of handmade clay blocks used before World War I. The house wasn't that old. That didn't make sense. Daniel's mind started connecting fragments of memory. The seller's odd reluctance when he'd asked about renovations. The missing section of blueprints the realtor had probably misplaced. The faint draft that always seemed to come from that corner in winter. He felt it again now, a whisper of air brushing against his wrist through the tiny opening. Someone had sealed something behind that wall. He fetched a chisel and hammer from the workbench, the metal cold in his grip. He hesitated, heart thudding in his ears. He wasn't superstitious, an engineer by trade, a man of logic, but there was something about the silence of that basement, the way the shadows gathered around the far corners, that made the air feel heavy. He struck once. A sharp crack split the room. Then again, brick dust filled the air like smoke, coating his throat. Bit by bit, a larger section gave way, revealing the black mouth of a cavity beyond. He shone the flashlight inside. The beam caught on something metallic. A hinge. Daniel froze. His brain stuttered to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The outline of a small iron door, set flush within the brick wall, its surface mottled with rust and time. He leaned closer, his breath fogging against it. Someone had built a door into the foundation. And then, for just a moment, as the beam trembled over the metal, he thought he saw something move on the other side. The next morning, Daniel stood in front of the wall with a coffee mug that had gone cold in his hand. He hadn't told anyone about what he'd found. Not his co-workers, not his neighbor, not even his ex-wife, who still called occasionally to check in on how he was managing the house. He wasn't sure how to describe it anyway. There was a hidden door in his basement. That sounded insane. The iron was old and heavy, a patchwork of rust and decay. When he rapped it gently with the handle of his screwdriver, it answered with a dull metallic echo that seemed too deep, too vast. There was definitely space behind it. The handle, if it had ever existed, was long gone, replaced by a circular indentation, almost like a key socket, but oddly shaped. He crouched closer. Around the frame, he noticed the same strange symbol that had been carved into the brick before. The circle crossed by two lines, repeated faintly in the metal's corrosion pattern. He ran his finger over it again, tracing the shape until a fine film of reddish dust came away on his skin. That's when he realized the air coming through the crack around the door wasn't stale. It was cool, faintly metallic, and somehow clean. As though whatever was behind there wasn't just empty space, but a sealed environment of its own. He took a step back and stared. Who would build a reinforced chamber behind a residential basement wall? By noon, his curiosity had curdled into obsession. He searched county records, pored over old property maps, tried to find any mention of earlier structures on his lot. Nothing. The house had been built in the early 70s, part of a suburban development that replaced a defunct textile mill. Before that, according to the oldest archives, the land had been undeveloped. Undeveloped. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. That word had started to sound like a lie. When he returned to the basement that evening, flashlight in one hand, he found something he couldn't explain. The floor in front of the door, where his boots had left dusty prints the night before, was clean. Wiped clean, as if someone, or something, had been standing there after him. Daniel's rational mind fought against the unease creeping up his spine. He told himself there had to be a logical explanation, air drafts, condensation, maybe a trick of the light. But when he crouched and ran his hand across the floor, the dustless patch was real, smooth and cold, surrounded by the faint outlines of disturbed powder. It looked like footprints. Bare ones. He recoiled, heartbeat kicking up. The prints ended abruptly at the base of the iron door, as if whoever, whatever, had made them had walked straight into the wall. He stood there for nearly a minute, frozen, his mind racing through every possible explanation. None made sense. The basement had only one entrance, the stairway, and it was locked from above. That night, Daniel couldn't focus on anything else. He sat at his kitchen table surrounded by the scattered papers he'd pulled from the county archives. The floor plan of his property was simple: foundation, crawl space, basement. No mention of any substructure. Yet an odd detail caught his eye on a faded survey from 1929, a faint, unlabeled rectangle drawn beneath the current property line, almost like an underground room. He flipped through the documents until a note scribbled in pencil at the bottom margin caught his eye. Original structure, pre-1890 foundation preserved. Pre-1890? That was nearly a century before his house was built. He went back downstairs, flashlight beam jittering over the unfinished wall. He pressed his palm flat against the iron door. Cold. Solid. Yet behind it, something waited. An idea formed. He rummaged through his workbench until he found his inspection camera, a tool he used for wiring jobs. It had a thin, flexible probe that could snake into tight spaces. He eased it into the gap between the bricks and the metal frame, threading it through until the lens slipped past the edge. The tiny screen flickered to life. Static. Then, a blur of darkness. He adjusted the focus. The image sharpened. A narrow space. Brick walls. Something pale on the floor. Maybe stone. Maybe fabric. He leaned closer, frowning. Then the camera feed glitched. For one brief second, the screen filled with static. And a face appeared. Not a reflection. Not a trick. A human face, pale and unmoving, inches from the lens. The feed went black. Daniel dropped the camera so fast it clattered against the concrete, the screen flickering once more before dying completely. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand, cutting across the rough wall like a blade of light through fog. For several seconds, he didn't move. He just listened, to the hum of the furnace, to the faint creak of the pipes, to his own heartbeat thudding in his ears like heavy machinery. The silence pressed in. Nothing. Finally, he forced himself to pick up the inspection camera. The display was dark. The battery light blinked red once, then died. He unplugged the probe, turned it over in his hands. Everything seemed normal, except for the faint smell of ozone, as though something had burned out inside. He replayed what he'd seen in his mind. It couldn't have been a face. Maybe it was a reflection, a distortion. But the detail, the curve of a cheekbone, the shadow of an eye socket, the pale lips, it was too vivid. He sat on the basement steps, staring at the wall, and whispered to himself, maybe it's a mannequin, storage or something. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The next morning, Daniel called his old college friend, Dr. Nadia Ruiz, a historian who specialized in early urban development. He kept his voice steady, casual. Hey Nad, weird question. You ever come across properties in New England with old sealed basements or hidden chambers? She laughed at first, but when he described the iron door and the pre-1890 foundation, her tone changed. Where exactly are you? He gave her the address. There was a pause on the line. Daniel, your lot was part of a property that burned down in 1894. Textile magnate named Aldous Marin. Mansion collapsed during a fire. They said the lower floors were sealed afterward because... Because what? Because the workers refused to rebuild. Said there were things left behind. A cold weight settled in Daniel's chest. Things. Bodies, she said softly. At least one wasn't recovered. The call ended, but her words kept echoing. Daniel looked at the wall again. If there was a body behind it, he told himself, that would explain everything. He didn't yet realize that was the least terrifying possibility. By evening, Daniel's logic had surrendered to a single consuming thought. He had to open that door. He spent hours researching online, restoration forums, urban archaeology threads, even niche Reddit pages filled with armchair historians. Nothing he found matched his situation. Every image of sealed basements or hidden vaults looked mundane compared to the iron barrier lurking beneath his house. At midnight, he returned to the basement armed with a crowbar, gloves, and a lantern. The concrete was cold beneath his knees as he knelt in front of the door. The faint draft that slipped through the edges had grown stronger, cooler, like a steady breath. He wedged the crowbar into the seam between the bricks and the metal. The first pull did nothing. The second groaned. Dust spilled like ash. The sound of tearing mortar echoed through the hollow room. Finally, the edge gave, just enough for him to get leverage. The door shifted slightly. Then it stopped, locked by something on the other side. Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing the crowbar deeper. The metal screeched, protesting after decades of silence. Then, with a thunderous crack, the seal broke. A gust of air rushed out, damp, ancient, tinged with something sweet and foul. He coughed, covering his face. The lantern's light flickered, nearly dying in the rush. When it steadied, he saw that the door had opened only a few inches, enough to peer inside. Behind it was darkness. Real darkness. Not the kind created by shadow, but the kind that seemed to swallow light. Daniel pushed his flashlight through the opening, angling it into the void. The beam hit brick walls, low and narrow, like a tunnel. The floor was uneven, covered in debris. And in the center, a shape. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was a bundle of something wrapped in cloth, sitting upright against the wall, its outline stiff and human-like. Daniel's breath hitched. He forced the door open wider, metal shrieking on rusted hinges. The shape toppled forward, hitting the ground with a muffled thud. The wrapping split at the shoulder. Beneath the rotten fabric, something pale glimmered in the light. It wasn't bone. It was porcelain. A doll's face, human-sized, too lifelike, its glass eyes staring up through a film of dust. And behind it, deep in the dark, something else moved. Daniel froze, one knee on the concrete, the lantern trembling in his hand. The sound had been unmistakable, a shuffle, faint but deliberate, coming from beyond the narrow chamber. He aimed the light again. The porcelain figure lay collapsed at his feet, its painted lips cracked, one glass eye missing. Behind it, the tunnel stretched farther than he'd thought. The beam of his flashlight couldn't reach the end. Hello. His voice echoed off the brick and came back warped, hollow. Is anyone in there? Only silence. But the air felt alive. Each breath he took seemed met by another exhale from the darkness, as though the tunnel itself was breathing with him. He steadied his nerves and crawled through the opening. The bricks scraped his shoulders. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. His breath came out in visible clouds. The space widened into a small chamber, no larger than a single room. The ceiling arched low, dripping with condensation. Wooden crates lay stacked against the far wall, their labels faded to ghosts. On one, he could just make out the black lettering. Marin Textiles, 1888. The same name Nadia had mentioned. He set the lantern down and pried open the nearest crate. Inside were bolts of disintegrating fabric, silk, maybe, long rotted to gray strands. Beneath them, something metallic gleamed. A brass cylinder, sealed with wax. He lifted it carefully. The wax had been stamped with the same symbol carved into the bricks, the circle crossed by two lines. His heart raced. This wasn't storage. This was a vault. Someone had hidden these deliberately, sealing them off beneath the later foundation. He peeled the wax away and pulled the cylinder open. Inside were rolled documents, still intact. He unfurled one. It wasn't a ledger or blueprint. It was a medical diagram. Human anatomy. Detailed, precise, but wrong. The proportions weren't natural. The spine curved too sharply. The skull had extra cavities. He felt a pulse of nausea and shoved the paper back inside. A faint sound made him spin, a soft, rhythmic tapping from deeper in the dark. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. He lifted the lantern, every nerve screaming. The sound came again, closer this time, from inside one of the sealed crates. For a moment, Daniel thought it was the echo of his heartbeat. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. 3 taps. Silence. Then 2 more, like someone, or something, testing the air from inside. He raised the lantern, its flame flickering as if nervous itself. The light washed over the stacked crates until it found the one nearest the floor. The wood was damp, swollen, its nails corroded into black streaks. The tapping came from there. Is someone there? His voice cracked as soon as it left him. No response. Just one more tap, soft, like knuckles on wood. His body screamed to leave, but his mind refused. He'd come too far. He needed to know. Daniel set the lantern on the ground and pulled a crowbar from his belt loop. The metal bit into the lid, groaning as he pried. Dust rained down. Each creak of wood made him flinch, but the urge to see outweighed the fear of what he might find. The last plank snapped free. The smell hit him first. Old air, thick with mold, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. He aimed the light inside. The crate wasn't full of fabric or tools. It was lined with straw and sealed glass jars, dozens of them, arranged with surgical precision. Inside each jar floated something pale and preserved, fragments of bone, twisted shapes that might have been animal or human. One jar had what looked unmistakably like a hand, small, childlike, curled into a fist. Daniel staggered back, while rising in his throat. The jars shimmered in the lantern light. The liquid inside tinged faintly amber, as if aged with time. Labels and faded ink marked each specimen. Subject 4B, spinal deformity, ocular variation. He stumbled toward another crate and ripped it open, desperate to prove the horror wrong, to find bolts of cloth, not this nightmare. Inside lay a single object wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it slowly. A mask. Porcelain. Human features too perfect, too symmetrical. Tiny hinges on the sides suggested it had once fit over a face. He dropped it instinctively. It clattered against the stone, and from the darkness, another sound answered. A low exhale. Wet. Close. Something in that room had just breathed back. Daniel froze, his pulse roaring in his ears. The breath hadn't been imagined. It was too close, too real. A wet, rasping inhale followed by silence. He swung the lantern toward the sound, the golden light trembling across the walls. Nothing moved, yet the air itself seemed to shift, as though something large had just drawn back into the shadows. He took one slow step backward. The jars rattled faintly in their crates, responding to the vibration of his movement, or to something else. The glass shimmered. For a split second, he could have sworn one of the preserved hands twitched, its tiny fingers flexing in the viscous fluid. He blinked hard. It was still again. "Who's there?" he whispered. His voice came out hoarse, barely audible. A pause. Then, from the tunnel behind him, a faint whisper, too soft to make out words, but undeniably human. The hairs on his neck stood on end. It sounded female, the syllables drawn out like breath through teeth. He snatched up the crowbar, brandishing it toward the sound, the absurdity of it dawning on him even as adrenaline kept him moving. "If someone's in here, you need to come out now." The whisper came again, closer this time, crawling along the brick like a current of air. It wasn't English. The words curved wrong, old and foreign, a language that felt ancient in his bones. His light wavered over the far wall. Something caught the glow, a set of faint markings etched into the brick, identical to the circle and cross symbol he'd seen before, but multiplied. Dozens of them, scratched into the surface by hand. They formed a pattern, spiraling toward a point in the center where the mortar had been disturbed. Daniel stepped closer, unable to stop himself. The whisper rose in pitch, words overlapping, urgent. He pressed his hand against the center of the spiral, and the wall gave way. A section of brick shifted inward, releasing a gust of freezing air that snuffed the lantern's flame. In total darkness, Daniel heard one sound, the slow creak of something heavy moving within the chamber. Then a whisper, right beside his ear this time. Not yet. Daniel stumbled backward, slamming against the crates. The lantern had gone out completely. Only the thin beam of his flashlight, half drained, shaking in his hand, cut through the black. The words "not yet" still rang in his ears, though he couldn't tell if he'd heard them aloud or inside his head. He forced himself to breathe. "You're imagining it," he whispered. "You're tired. Oxygen's bad down here." But the air was fresh, cold, not the stifling decay of a sealed cellar. Something about this chamber was preserved. He relit the lantern with trembling hands. The light pushed the shadows back inch by inch. The spiral of symbols on the wall looked deeper now, as if the brick itself had flexed. The section he'd pressed stood slightly ajar. Behind it was a void. He leaned closer. Inside, a narrow recess glowed faintly, as if something metallic inside reflected the light back at him. He reached in, fingers brushing against cold metal. When he pulled it free, his breath caught. It was a locket, tarnished silver, heavy and ornate, etched with the same circle cross symbol. He flicked it open. Inside was a small photograph, sepia-toned, two figures standing beside a massive loom. A man with severe eyes and a young girl clutching a porcelain doll. On the back, written in elegant script, Aldous and Clara, 1889. His stomach turned. Aldous Marin, the name Nadia had mentioned. This had to be the same family. But Clara, who was she? As he studied the photo, he noticed a faint hum building in the air. At first he thought it was the lantern, but it came from behind the newly opened recess. A vibration, rhythmic and low, like machinery starting after years of silence. Then came the faintest tick-tick-tick, as if from a clock buried behind the wall. The sound grew louder. The light in the chamber flickered. He looked down. The photograph trembled in his hand, the girl's printed eyes seeming to shimmer with reflected light. Daniel's flashlight flickered, then died. The ticking stopped, and from somewhere inside the wall, a tiny metallic voice whispered, distorted, mechanical. "Clara is awake." Daniel stood frozen, the locket trembling between his fingers. The voice had been faint, distorted, almost like a phonograph recording, but the words were clear. "Clara is awake." He turned the lantern slowly toward the recess again, but nothing moved inside. Only the small metal cavity, breathing back the echo of his own heartbeat. He wanted to run, to seal the door and never come back. But something inside him, curiosity, compulsion, madness, wouldn't let him. The name Clara pulsed in his mind. He climbed the stairs out of the basement, shaking, every step accompanied by the dull clang of the crowbar against his side. The morning light filtering through the kitchen window felt unreal, too bright. He poured himself a drink, though it was barely 8 a.m., hands trembling so badly the whiskey sloshed over the rim. By noon, he was back on the phone with Nadia. "There was a girl," he said. "Clara Marin. Does that name mean anything to you?" There was a long silence. "Daniel, where did you hear that?" He told her everything. The locket, the voice, the strange chamber beneath his house. He expected laughter, disbelief. But Nadia didn't laugh. Instead, she said, "That name doesn't appear in any of the Marin family archives. Not officially. But there are letters, gossip, really, from the 1890s. Workers whispered about a child Aldous Marin kept hidden in the house. Some said she was sick. Others said she wasn't human." Daniel gripped the phone tighter. "Not human. Experimental," Nadia said quietly. There were rumors he was funding biological research in secret. The textile factory was just a cover. He worked with early mechanical prosthetics, limbs that moved with steam and pressure systems. Some said he was trying to fuse living tissue with metal. Daniel thought of the porcelain face, the preserved limbs in jars, the mechanical whisper. Nadia exhaled shakily. Daniel, you need to leave that basement sealed. Whatever he built down there, it wasn't meant to be found. But Daniel was already walking back down the stairs, the phone pressed to his ear. Because the moment Nadia said the word fuse, the lantern in the basement flickered again, on its own. And from the darkness near the iron door came the soft, unmistakable sound of tiny porcelain feet moving across the floor. The sound was faint but deliberate. Light taps against the stone floor, measured, almost delicate. Daniel stopped halfway down the basement steps, gripping the railing hard enough to make his knuckles whiten. The lantern's glow pulsed weakly below, throwing long shadows that crawled up the walls like ink. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," he called, his voice dry, cracking. "Is someone down there?" No answer, just the faint hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the same mechanical pulse he'd heard when he found the locket. He descended slowly, each step amplifying his heartbeat. The smell of iron and dust grew stronger. The air was charged, metallic, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. When he reached the bottom, he froze. The locket lay open on the ground where he'd dropped it earlier. But it wasn't where he'd left it. It had been moved, closer to the iron door. He crouched, his breath shallow. The porcelain doll still lay in the chamber beyond, half buried in rags. Its cracked face was turned toward him now, the one remaining glass eye gleaming faintly in the lantern light. He swallowed hard and took a step forward. "Clara." The moment the name left his mouth, a faint hiss whispered through the room, air rushing through tiny gaps, as though the chamber itself inhaled. Then, from deep inside the tunnel, a soft metallic rattle. He lifted the lantern higher. Something was glinting far back in the dark. Movement. The light trembled in his hands. The glint came closer, slow, rhythmic. A pale shape emerging from the shadows, half human, half sculpture. Porcelain limbs jointed with brass. A face cracked but eerily expressive, its mouth stitched at the corners with fine copper wire. It stopped at the edge of the chamber, head tilting, glass eyes reflecting the lantern flame. Daniel backed away, the crowbar slick in his grip. What the hell? The figure's mouth clicked once, wires tightening. Then the same broken phonograph voice that had spoken from the wall rasped from somewhere inside it. Father said the light must stay on. Then, as Daniel's lantern flickered, the thing took one slow step toward him and smiled. Daniel stumbled backward, the lantern swinging wildly in his grasp. The porcelain creature paused, its head cocked slightly to one side, the fractured smile widening as the copper wire stretched across its mouth with a soft, metallic creak. "Stay back," he barked, his voice trembling. It didn't listen. The sound that came from its joints was a whisper of clockwork, faint clicks, tiny hisses, as though air still pulsed through the hollow channels of its limbs. It moved with a strange, hesitant rhythm, like it was learning how to walk again after decades of stillness. Each step left a small, powdered footprint of plaster and dust. Daniel raised the crowbar, his instincts screaming to swing, to crush, to destroy, but the creature stopped abruptly, staring at him with that single glass eye. For an awful second, he felt as if it were studying him. Then it spoke again, the voice warbling through some broken mechanism inside its chest. Father said, "No light." In the dark, the lantern flickered violently, its flame thinning to a trembling thread. Daniel panicked, shielding it with his hand, but when the light dimmed, the creature began to move faster, almost gliding. He bolted for the stairs, boots thudding on concrete. Behind him, the mechanical rasp followed. Click, hiss, click. The air filled with the faint scent of burnt oil and something older, something sweet and rotten. He reached the top step and slammed the door shut, twisting the bolt with shaking hands. The echo of movement below stopped. He stood there for a full minute, panting, listening. Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of the crowbar scraping across the basement floor, being dragged. His stomach twisted. He hadn't dropped it. That meant something had picked it up. He backed away from the door, heart hammering so loud it drowned out his thoughts. Then, from the other side of the wood, came 3 soft taps, measured, polite, almost human. And that same broken, dull-like whisper. Father said you'd come back. The bolt on the door trembled. Something was pushing from the other side. The door shuttered again, a low, steady pressure from the other side. Daniel's hands locked around the bolt. He could feel every vibration run through the old wood into his bones. "Stop," he whispered, though he didn't know to whom. The tapping came again, slower this time. Then silence. The air in the hallway thickened, heavy with the smell of rust and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. He took a trembling step back, waiting for another sound. None came. Finally, he forced himself to move. He crossed the kitchen, grabbed his phone, and dialed Nadia's number. It rang once, twice. Then, "Daniel." Her voice came through, groggy but concerned. He could barely breathe. "It's here, Nad. Something's in the basement." It moved. It spoke. There was a pause. What did it say? He hesitated, the words barely leaving his mouth. "It called me back. Like it knew I'd find it." Nadia's tone hardened. "Daniel, listen. You said your house was built over the Marin property, right? Then whatever's down there, it's not just old machinery. Aldous Marin wasn't a normal industrialist. He was obsessed with continuation, artificial life. A loud thud cut through the call. Daniel flinched, the phone nearly slipping from his grasp. The sound had come from the other side of the basement door again, heavy, deliberate. Then, impossibly, a faint scraping began, like metal against wood. "Daniel?" Nadia's voice came through again, muffled by static. "Are you there?" He lowered the phone slowly, staring as letters began etching themselves across the inside of the door. Thin grooves forming one by one, carved from the opposite side. At first they were just lines. Then they formed words. "Hello, Daniel." His heart seized. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the kitchen chair. The whisper came next, crawling through the wood grain like breath. "Father said you'd fix me." The phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. On the other end, Nadia's voice screamed his name. And from downstairs came the soft, rhythmic click, hiss, click, growing louder with every second. The door handle began to turn. The handle twisted once, then stopped. The house went silent, so silent that Daniel could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator across the room, the tick of the clock on the wall, and the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. He stared at the basement door, barely breathing. The carved letters seemed to shimmer in the weak light from the kitchen bulb. "Hello, Daniel." For one desperate second, he hoped he was dreaming. But then the handle moved again, slow, deliberate, followed by a soft metallic creak from below. He backed toward the counter, grabbed the first thing his shaking hand touched, a kitchen knife. "Stay back," he croaked, though the words felt ridiculous. Whatever was down there wasn't afraid of him. The door went still. Then, a faint click. It opened an inch, just enough for a draft of air to slip through, cold and damp. Daniel's flashlight lay on the table. He snatched it up and aimed the beam into the gap. Nothing, just the dark descending staircase. But when he moved closer, the beam caught something halfway up the steps, a reflection. Metal. He focused the light and saw the edge of the crowbar. It was standing upright, balanced perfectly against the railing. Balanced. That was impossible. Then, from below, the same distorted voice rasped again, clearer this time, almost pleading. "Father said, I can be perfect again." The knife slipped from his hand and clattered to the tile. "You know how, Daniel." He froze. The voice was closer now, just at the bottom of the stairs. His name again, but softer this time, spoken like an intimate secret. The beam of the flashlight trembled across the walls until it landed on something halfway up the staircase. A pale, porcelain hand gripping the banister. Its fingers flexed once, the joints clicking softly, almost like knuckles popping. Daniel took a step back. Then another. The hand tightened its grip. A head rose slowly into view, the cracked doll face catching the light, copper wires twitching at the corners of its mouth. "You'll fix me," it whispered. "You promised." Then it took another step upward. The floorboards creaked under its weight, and Daniel realized, with sick horror, it was heavier than before. The step groaned beneath its weight, not hollow like porcelain, but solid, deliberate. Daniel's mind rebelled at the sound. The thing had been fragile, brittle, a doll made of glass and wire, but now, it moved like something alive. The beam of his flashlight shook in his trembling hand. As the creature climbed, he saw the truth forming in fragments. The porcelain skin no longer gleamed clean white. Beneath the cracks, veins of red had begun to pulse faintly, threading through the ceramic like roots through stone. The seams between plates of porcelain flexed, revealing glimpses of muscle. Wet, pink, human. Daniel stumbled backward, breath hitching. The room tilted. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible." The creature tilted its head in response, as though curious. The faint hum inside it, once mechanical, now throbbed with the uneven rhythm of a heartbeat. It spoke again, voice softer now, closer to a child's. "You fixed the walls. You found the door. You heard me." Daniel's knees almost buckled. "You're not real," he said. You're machinery, some experiment." The creature stepped into the light. Its face, still half doll, half human, twitched with something that might have been emotion. "Father said no one would come. But you did." It reached a trembling hand toward him. The fingers were coated in plaster dust, but beneath the flaking shell, he saw the soft give of flesh. He staggered back, knocking over a chair. It crashed to the floor, shattering the silence. Then the lights in the kitchen flickered, once, twice, before bursting into darkness. Daniel's flashlight sputtered. He dropped it. The room plunged into a suffocating blackness broken only by the faint glow from the creature's chest, the same circular symbol glowing faintly red beneath its ribs. The voice came again, close enough that he could feel the air shift near his face. He said I wasn't finished. Something cold brushed against his wrist. Fingers, human, warm. He jerked away. "Stay away from me. Please," it whispered. "Help me be whole." Then the glow in its chest pulsed, and something behind it moved in the shadows. Something bigger. The glow from the creature's chest cast just enough light for Daniel to see movement behind it. Slow, lumbering, wet. He froze. The smaller one, the one that called itself Clara, turned slightly, head cocking toward the darkness as if listening. Then came the sound, a deep, dragging scrape, like something massive being pulled across the basement floor. Clara's voice wavered, glitching through her stitched mouth. "Father," woke the other. Daniel stumbled backward, gripping the counter edge for balance. "The other," he rasped. The darkness behind her shifted again, the faint red light illuminating a second form, half hidden. It was larger, thicker, its limbs distorted. The face, if it could be called that, was an amalgam of porcelain plates and human tissue, mismatched and fused together by metal brackets. Its mouth hung slightly open, wires twitching inside like tendons. The air filled with a low, rhythmic breathing, mechanical and human at once. Daniel's mind screamed run, but his legs wouldn't move. The second creature stepped forward, the floorboards groaning beneath its weight. Its head jerked side to side, as though searching, the jaw clicking in a horrible attempt at speech. Then, in a sound that barely resembled a voice, it managed. "Father said, finish me." Clara turned toward Daniel. "You can fix us," she whispered. He left the pieces. She pointed to the stairs that led down into the basement. Even from where he stood, Daniel could see faint movement below, the crates shifting, something stirring among the preserved specimens. He shook his head violently. "No, I'm not your father. I'm not him." Clara tilted her head again. The second creation mimicked the motion, as though connected by invisible strings. Then, in eerie unison, both said, "You built the wall." Daniel's blood ran cold. What are you talking about?" But before he could finish, Clara's chest light brightened, casting the room in a pulsing red glow. The air around him seemed to bend with it, vibrating like heat-off asphalt. In that light, for the briefest instant, Daniel saw something impossible. A reflection on the wall beside him, faint but unmistakable. A man standing behind the creatures. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and soot-black hands. The real Aldous Marin, smiling. For one disbelieving heartbeat, Daniel thought the reflection was a trick of the flickering light. But as the pulse from Clara's chest steadied, the shape on the wall held. The man's outline was unmistakable, tall, stooped, coat dusted with ash, his face hollow and sharp like a charcoal sketch brought to life. His eyes glowed with the same faint red that burned in the creature's chests. Then he moved. Not in the reflection, in the room. Daniel stumbled back, slamming into the refrigerator. The clang echoed through the house. The apparition's gaze followed him with a mechanical precision that felt learned, not natural. When it finally spoke, its voice came in overlapping tones, human breath mixed with the hiss of an ancient phonograph. You opened what was meant to stay closed. Daniel's throat tightened. You're Marin? The thing nodded slowly. Aldous Marin. Creator. Father. Flesh and design. Its head tilted slightly, like a marionette tugged by unseen strings. You disturbed the experiment. They woke because you did what I could not. You remembered them. Behind Marin, Clara stood motionless, head bowed like a child waiting for approval. The larger creature hovered in the doorway, its body twitching in fractured rhythm. Daniel's mind spiraled. This is impossible. You're dead. This house was built decades after you. Marin stepped closer. The smell of ozone and burnt fabric thickened in the air. Not death, he said softly. Transference. Flesh fails, but thought can be preserved. Machine. Porcelain. Wire. He gestured toward Clara, his blackened fingers trembling. I made her to hold what I could not. My daughter. My design. Daniel shook his head, desperate. You locked them down there. I saved them. The voice rose, distortion flaring. The world wasn't ready. They called me a monster, buried my work, sealed it under your home. You, Daniel, broke the seal. The legacy is yours now. I want no part of this, Daniel hissed. Marin's red eyes dimmed, then flared again. It's too late. The moment you opened the wall, the conduit chose you. The temperature plummeted. Frost crept up the walls. Clara raised her head. The wires at her mouth snapped with a wet pop. And in a voice that was suddenly, horrifyingly human, she whispered, Father, he looks just like you. Daniel's stomach twisted. Just like you. The words echoed inside his skull like a nail driven deep. He turned toward the reflection in the window, and for the first time, he saw what Clara meant. The soot-streaked figure of Aldous Marin stood beside him, yet their faces, their profiles, were nearly identical. His pulse stumbled. No, that's continuity, Marin interrupted, his voice layered with static and breath. The experiment was never about machines, Daniel. It was about inheritance. Flesh and memory bound together. Every structure built here was seeded with it. You didn't buy this house. It found you. Daniel backed away, shaking his head violently. That's impossible. I'm not your blood. The apparition smiled faintly, a grotesque parody of pride. You carry the fragment. My mark endures through the conduit. My work lives when another completes it. He gestured toward the wall where Daniel had first struck the plaster weeks ago. You didn't open it by chance. You remembered where it was. The light from Clara's chest pulsed faster now, syncing with Daniel's racing heartbeat. He could feel a faint vibration under his skin, a rhythmic hum in his bones that wasn't his own. No, he whispered, pressing a hand to his sternum. Get out of me. Get out. Marin's form wavered, fading like smoke. You can't undo what's begun. The legacy must finish itself. You are the vessel. Clara stepped closer, porcelain fragments falling from her face as something softer, almost human, shifted beneath. Father, she said, her voice trembling, he's breaking. Marin turned toward her. Then bind him. Daniel bolted. Daniel lunged for the front door, every instinct in his body screaming run, but the moment his hand touched the knob, the metal burned his palm. He yelped and stumbled back. The air shimmered, warping like heat over asphalt, and for a dizzy instant, the world folded in on itself. Rooms blurring, lights flickering, voices overlapping. You can't leave. Marin's voice rasped from nowhere and everywhere at once. You are the continuation. Daniel staggered toward the kitchen window, desperate for open air, but as he looked outside, he saw only darkness. Not night, not shadow, but an endless, moving black that seemed alive. Shapes shifted within it, flickering like silhouettes pressed against glass. Then the floor trembled. From the basement, a grinding noise erupted, stone against stone, iron scraping concrete. The house groaned as if alive. The walls rippled, breathing with slow, heaving exhalations. Clara's voice rose from below, childlike and pleading. He hurts. Please, Father, make him stay. Daniel turned and froze. She was halfway up the stairs, her form shedding porcelain shards with each movement, revealing sinew and metal beneath, a grotesque sculpture of both. Her single glass eye glowed red. Behind her, the larger creature, the other, dragged itself forward, hands clawing through the steps. Its jaw hung open, wires sparking as it struggled to speak. Finish the wall, it moaned. Marin's figure solidified beside Daniel, his hand black and cold as it closed around Daniel's wrist. "You opened it," he whispered. "Now you must close it from the inside." Daniel fought to pull free, but his strength was fading. The air pulsed like a heartbeat, pulling him toward the basement door. The locket, still open on the floor, vibrated violently, its light matching the red glow in Clara's chest. He made one last, desperate choice. Grabbing the crowbar from the floor, he swung with all his strength, not at the creatures, not at Marin, but at the lantern. It shattered, flame blooming across the wood, light flaring brighter than the dark could swallow. The scream that followed was inhuman. Metal, child, machine, and then the wall split open once more, swallowing the fire, the figures, the sound. When the firefighters arrived hours later, they found nothing but a collapsed basement wall and ash. No door, no chamber, no Daniel Reeves. Only one object survived the blaze, a small silver locket, lying in the soot. Inside, the photograph had changed. Now, there were 3 figures standing by the loom: Aldous, Clara, and Daniel.